You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record. We're recording this podcast for the benefit of my son and Jake's grandson, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're putting all of these episodes out on YouTube for free for everyone to enjoy. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm very happy and I'm very proud because this is the final episode of season 1 of both Star Trek, but also the final episode of season 1 of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. I think we've achieved something pretty big here. We've gotten through all 26 episodes and our first season's done. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Same nod to you.
Thank you. That being said, I think one thing that we talked about last episode with Conspiracy is that episode really did feel like a proper season finale, where the neutral zone really doesn't feel like much of a story at all. I think the thing that bothers me the most about the neutral zone is how much of a non-story it actually is. Nothing really happens in it. So, I'm just not a fan of this episode. So what did you think about it?
Well, I kind of agree with you. I think it's fun and enjoyable. But I wonder if the writers they know, okay, we're coming up to end of season 1. Did they just kind of run out of gas a little bit?
So there's actually an interesting story behind this. So this script was basically produced on a first draft because there was a writer's strike in May of 1988 when this happened. So the writers weren't allowed to actually go back in and improve whatever ideas that they had for the script or whatever they intended it to be. So Gene Roddenberry basically produced it as is. And I think, on one hand, there's some interesting things that happened in this. I know that doing some research, this was intended to be part of a trilogy of episodes that were kind of interlinked to each other. But it just kind of never really happened. When writing this first season, the head writer Maurice Hurley intended it to be the first part of a trilogy that would continue in the second season, in which the Borg would be formally introduced, and there would be an alliance between the Federation and the Romulan Empire, which, as we know in the show, didn't happen. So, again, I think this show kind of this episode tried to set up things that we thought were happening or were going to happen in the show, but with Gene Roddenberry kind of taking a back seat in season 2, I think a lot of this kind of falls to the wayside. And in some ways, a lot of season 1 falls to the wayside too. I started watching the first episode of season 2 today with Ben, and there's a real... I think we are going to be very shocked by kind of the departure in terms of the production values of the show. It's still going to be the same show in terms of the ship, the crew, Beverly Crusher. This is the last episode that we're going to see Beverly Crusher for an entire season. There's a lot of things that are going to change after this episode starting in season 2. But let's stick to this right now.
Well, just a
Yeah, go ahead.
comment and question and another question. So I wonder, if there was this writer strike, and obviously the script was written before it was aired in May of
Right.
1988. So then over this, I wonder when they started production on season two, because once things sorted out with the strike and the writers, they recreated or, during, kind of made some changes in who the writers were. I would think that they probably said, okay, let's critically look at what we did in season one. How can we change things? How can we do better? How can we juice it up a little? I guess I would think they would have done that.
Well,
And
I
and
think there's a couple things happening. Um, sorry, I didn't mean to
no, no,
interrupt,
no,
but
no, that's a good point to answer that first. Sure.
I think one of two things are happening. One is I think Gene Roddenberry's tenure is coming to a close, and a lot of his lieutenants and a lot of the people around him are going to start disappearing with him. Part of it's his drug abuse. Like, his drug abuse is finally going to catch up with him. And we have to remember, this is airing in 1988. He's
Mhm.
going to be dead in October of 1991.
Mm,
So,
mhm,
he's really not long for this. And
mhm,
he's somewhat deteriorating by this point.
mhm.
And he's not necessarily becoming the most trustworthy individual for the studios to
Mhm.
have as like the actual showrunner or one of the main writers. Now, as a
Right.
producer and someone with his name on it, that's a different thing.
Mhm.
But Gene Roddenberry is really going to be taking a step back here after this episode.
Right.
And in some ways,
Now, my
like,
other question is,
oh
you go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, if Dr. Crusher, Gates McFadden isn't in season two, does then she show up again in season three? And why did do you know why she took a break? Why Gates
uh,
McFadden took a break?
Roddenberry did not like Gates McFadden.
Really?
He simply did
Wow.
not like Gates McFadden, and I think it's who is played by
Dr. Pulaski. Yeah.
Pulaski's played by Diane Mulder? No.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Um
right.
she had been in the original series
Hmm.
previously,
Yeah.
and Roddenberry liked her a lot, so
Well, then
they
a
tried to bring her in.
and a reciprocal question. I wonder if Gates McFadden liked Gene Roddenberry.
Gates McFadden apparently had no issue with Gene Roddenberry. She just never understood why Gene Roddenberry didn't like her.
I see. Well, yeah.
It was legitimately like Gene simply did not like Gates McFadden, which I don't understand either. But we also
Yeah.
have to remember, like, for all the genius of Gene Roddenberry, he really is in the midst of his addictions here. So, like, a
Mhm.
lot of the stuff that we're seeing and a lot of the ideas that we've heard for, we've discussed some of these behind the scenes, like, Troy was supposed to be this overly sexualized character. Um, there were supposed to be a lot more sexualization and sexual exploration in some of these episodes previously that, like, they had to stop Gene on.
Mhm.
I think a lot of what is happening is Gene is not being able to read the room as well as he may have used to.
Mhm.
But also, like, maybe some of his maybe some of his ideas are outdated, because at this time, even though the show is doing well in terms of viewership and ratings, critically it's not being reviewed very well. There's a lot of people who think a lot of these episodes, like Code of Honor,
Mhm.
are extremely weak or troublesome.
Mhm.
Episodes like this, the Neutral Zone, kind of a weak episode if you really think
Mhm.
about it.
Yes.
Kind of getting into this and getting into season one in itself. I think one thing that season one gets accused of a lot is, and season two as well. There's this kind of belief that until the Borg show up at the end of season two, beginning of season three, that's when the show starts to get good. But I think that a lot of the things that we remember the most about Star Trek The Next Generation actually happened in these first two seasons. Like some of the things that are just kind of like the cultural markers of the
Mm-hmm.
show for us
Mm-hmm.
happen here in these episodes. So I think there's kind of this interesting dichotomy. On one hand, like you have some really iconic things, like the introduction of Q happens in this first season. It doesn't happen in any other season. Um, I think you have some really important things that have kind of become important to the iconography or the storytelling in the world building of Star Trek: The Next Generation, even though
Mm-hmm.
these episodes themselves may not be the best. And in some cases, like I think the Neutral Zone really is kind of a rewriting of something I've been talking about a lot when it comes to Romulans, but there's a real element of balance of terror here,
Mm-hmm.
along with the story about the cryogenic travelers who've been awakened from their deep
Mm-hmm.
sleep in space.
Right.
Did I answer your questions, or
Yeah,
did I
you did.
ramble on?
No,
Okay,
that was fun.
so let's give everyone a little bit of an introduction of where we are in this episode. So um, Captain Picard is attending an emergency conference on Starbase 718 when the Enterprise D waits for a shuttle to while the Enterprise D waits for a shuttle to return. They observe an ancient space capsule that's apparently of Earth origin. Data requests permission to beam over with Worf and investigate this kind of age-old relic of Earth history. When they're there, they discover two decomposed humans, one empty pod, and three pods containing humans that have been kept frozen in cryogenic stasis. These humans are beamed back over and they are resuscitated or revived after their various ailments have been healed. But as Picard comes back on board, it's revealed that during the conference, the Federation and Starfleet have given him orders to head to the neutral zone because the Romulans apparently have reappeared and may be attacking outposts
Yeah,
along the
there's a number
neutral
of
zone.
Federation outposts that have been destroyed, and they need to go to the neutral zone to investigate who did it. The suspects. The suspicion is that it's Romulans because it's a neutral zone between the Federation and Romulan space.
And there's a previously mentioned incident called the Tomid incident, which is the last time that the Federation and the Romulans ran into each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's been, I think, at one point there. I think they say it's been something like over 50 years since
Yes,
they've had any
right.
contact with the Romulans, which is kind of interesting because it seems throughout the rest of the galaxy they have regular interactions with their neighbors and maybe their trading partners.
Mm-hmm.
I've always found it interesting that the Romulans themselves, and we'll get into them when they really show up at the end of the episode, but the Romulans themselves have always been very fascinating to me as a quote unquote race in the world building of Star Trek. Because we know a lot about Vulcans because of Spock and the subsequent movies where we've actually gone back to Vulcan and seen a lot of Vulcan culture take place. But for the most part, Romulans have remained fairly insular, not only in their own culture, but in terms of the cultural knowledge we have of them as fans of Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
There really isn't a lot that we know about them. And it's interesting to know that Roddenberry and Maurice Hurley had this intention of the Federation and the Romulans forming an alliance against the Borg. Because, they're going to appear here, but then they're not going to appear again for a while. So getting into the episode, before we get to the Romulans, let's talk about cryogenics. I think it's very interesting that, first of all, we have an episode that's starting with another diversion.
Yes, but at least this time they're not called away to another planet. It's just something that distracts them a little bit, and Picard has an important mission, so they don't have to change course and head off to another
Do you
planetary system. Right.
Do you find it interesting that Riker pays no attention to it whatsoever? I mean, it is a piece of Earth history, and he's basically like, "No, we have better things to do." It seems antithetical to the exploration of space and the accumulation of knowledge, especially from a time it seems where they don't have a lot of history. I'm thinking of a previous episode. Where did they go? Um, I'm thinking about the Big Goodbye,
Yeah.
where they bring that Earth historian on, and even then they seem, it doesn't seem like they have a large base knowledge of the 20th and 21st
You
centuries.
said Riker kind of dismissed it. You meant Picard dismissed it?
No, Riker dismisses it because initially, like, they find this capsule floating through space,
Right.
and it's Data who wants to investigate it. Originally,
Right.
Riker's
That's
just like,
right.
no, let it float off, because even Worf warns him, like, it's going to float through a binary star system and be torn apart, most
Well,
likely.
well, I would have wanted. I kind of agree with you based on what you're saying because, first of all, um, it would be worthwhile to have identified at least what it was, even if you didn't, send somebody over. Because one of the questions I had, if the way the story comes out, the three survivors, once they're on the Enterprise, they explain that, the backstory is explained as how they ended up being frozen. Then they say, oh, we were put into orbit to avoid power failures. They don't mention anything about how the energy on the capsule was maintained, whether it was solar, whether it was a nuclear source. But the real question was I had is
They did say that
if
they
it,
have a solar generator.
that's right. But that gets into if this capsule was so far out in deep space,
Right.
how did it get to deep space? And as it's going through deep space, there probably wasn't a lot of light energy to keep the solar generators going. So it's one of these technological holes in the story, which
Absolutely.
again, I've said, they have to have some, it's almost like a suspension of belief just so they can make the story work.
Well, the thing is, and you could probably speak to this a little bit more than I can. Cryonics really was at one point a pursuit for a lot of people, with the idea that they were going to freeze their body parts or their entire bodies.
Right.
With the idea when medical technology advanced, they would somehow be revived, resurrected, and resuscitated, to be treated and ultimately live out the rest of their days. I think that if you had something like that, or if it had worked, and you did put people out in space to, like, avoid quote unquote power failures, which I take it as, there was a worry about nuclear wars.
Right.
Um, it would make more sense to have, like, maybe the capsule's a satellite. And that got knocked out of Earth orbit and
Well,
was just traveling through the stars.
when Ralph Offenhouse mentions brownout at one point, remember there was
Oh
back in the
yeah.
late 70s the big Northeast power failure, which could be called it. Yeah, it was a blackout. It was much more than a brownout. But one interesting thing that when the crew was talking about what is cryonics, they said, "Oh well, it's something that kind of died out by
Hmm.
the end of the 20th century." And you know, I just looked something up because I made a comment that you know it was still around because when Ted Williams, the famous baseball player, died, he died in 2002. And you might recall there was a story that, well, they didn't freeze his whole body,
Oh
but
right.
they froze his head as though they were going to bring that back to life and transplant it onto, another body. So obviously,
Hey, they were able to transplant a monkey's brain from one body to another and make it work. So
but the brains weren't frozen. But
no, that's true.
I think right now I don't hear anything in the popular press or on CNN or Fox News about freezing bodies. I think it's kind of gone by the wayside. But it was interesting that they were kind of like making a prediction in the show that it's going to phase out because it really wasn't phased out still in 1988. I don't think.
Well, I think if you look at it from a medical application, uh, the idea of freezing people on a large scale with the idea of saving them later would first be uneconomical from a long-term perspective, because where are you going to start, where are you going to save all the where are you going to keep all of these frozen bodies, how are you going to keep them powered? um at some point there's only so much room, so not everyone can freeze. How do you resuscitate them? The entire kind of infrastructure on keeping this around just seems, you know, even from an outsider's perspective, not very viable. But two, Crusher kind of Crusher kind of gives away the real secret to why it fails when she wakes them all up and she's like, we figured out how to solve all of your problems through simple procedures and therapies now. I think the
Well,
goal is to eventually, just have something that, we inject into you and you no longer have cancer, or you no longer
well,
have heart
I have a little,
disease, or
that's a good point, but I have a little problem with what she said because, you know, um, Sonny, was a drug abuser, an alcoholic, and he was in liver failure.
yes.
And it's like, okay, Sonny, rather than being frozen, why didn't you have a liver transplant? I don't know what exact year in the 20th century
Because he wants to keep
he died.
drinking.
Yeah, but he could have had a liver transplant to save his life, and often has had heart disease. The woman, I can't remember her first name, had a stroke, but um, you know, Dr. Crusher says that these people, these patients, needed only minor medical therapy to correct their problems. And it's like, okay, if somebody has, you know, liver failure and the liver's about to crap out, how would you really fix that? And if somebody had a stroke, and part of the things when somebody has a stroke is they have hypoxia in the brain.
Hmm.
So even if these people are frozen, it gets back after death. How are you going? And I guess this is one of the general questions about cryonics, because we talked about the concept of somebody dies, particularly from trauma. There's this golden hour because there's these biochemical changes that are taking place,
Hmm.
and that you have to treat the patient in such a way so that
You
biochemically,
mentioned this on a previous
physiologically,
episode. Yeah.
yeah, biochemically and physiologically, you want to keep the physiologic and biochemical changes from going to a point of no return.
Right.
So if somebody has a is dying from heart disease or liver failure or stroke, where you're basically you know the brain's dying because of hypoxia, because of the blood clot. I don't understand, just in terms of cryogenic principles, the whole concept as it, was thought, how you could really then, you know, freeze the body and then, reverse those changes in the future.
Can
And
I?
because this is the other point is, if 24th century medicine
Hmm.
shouldn't have to fix problems like this, we would think that by the 24th century, even
Right.
before that, we would fix the things that we're trying to address in our healthcare now, of addressing, um, um, economic conditions, so that people don't have enough money and resources to buy healthy food. They're buying and eating the wrong kinds of food. That we take more of a preventive medicine approach so that people don't get sick, rather than, oh, if somebody has heart disease, we'll fix it real quick in the 20th century. I think that what I'd like to see in the future is medicine advance so that we don't get, they might have fixes for these diseases, but the medicine would be such that it prevents people from getting to advanced disease states, and that basically people in the future would die of old age. That's it.
Well, I think obviously in Star Trek people are dying, if they do die of natural causes, of advanced old age, because at the very first episode Bones is 130 something
30,
years.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So it's very obvious that people are living on well past the current human lifespan of, I think it's 70 something for us and 80 something for women right now.
Yeah,
But
yeah, women are like, I think men are like 76 and women have 2 additional years. And it's
yeah,
actually American lifespan, uh, as measured, has actually dropped a little bit in the last year because of the pandemic.
well, it was dropping beforehand because we weren't. Now, not only are we dealing with the pandemic, but beforehand we were also dealing with, um,
Opioids,
yeah, a terrible opioid epidemic.
which is
That
ongoing still,
well, it's
actually.
ongoing, just like our gun violence issue
Right,
too. But that another time.
right.
Um, I think getting to your question about cryonics, I don't know what to say about like this stroke victim. I think her name is Claire.
Hmm.
I don't know what to say about how they would actually fix Claire's issue. I would think when it comes to Ralph and
Sunny.
Sonny, when it comes to Sonny's liver, I bet you they were probably thinking, well, we'll take his liver, we'll scrape some cells off of it, and we'll grow him a new liver in the future and just resuscitate him with a new liver that way so he can keep drinking and partying. I think that's actually why he avoided a liver transplant in the first place, because you really can't drink after a liver
No,
transplant at
no,
all. It'll kill you.
no.
And I think he just wants to keep the party going. Um, I think with Ralph, Ralph's a little bit harder too, because even if they resuscitated him in the future and they were somehow able to restore his heart from this, I think they said he had cardiomyopathy.
Yeah, I just had heart disease,
Yeah.
basically.
Um, I don't know how they would restore the heart, but we know that Picard has a bionic heart, so it wouldn't be shocking to me in the future if they woke someone up from cryonics, like they just replaced their heart with a cybernetic one or a bionic one. Again, it's kind of the hole in the story, because
Mhm.
for cryonics to work, a lot of I think a lot of things have to happen to fall into place, and even this is so far fetched. Like you said, you have the solar powered capsule that's kind of floating through space, but how is it still being powered? Even to the point, when they opened up the capsule and looked inside, two of the people are dead, but one of the capsules is empty. There's no one in there, and there's no indication of where that person is. Data and Worf don't look for this missing crewman.
It's a good
So,
point.
so
Yeah.
it makes me wonder, like, did that person wake up at some point? How did they get off the capsule?
Right.
Where are
Right.
they?
Right.
Did they do it like 10 years ago? Was it 100 years ago when they woke up? There's a lot of interesting questions that never get
Sure.
answered about the
Yes.
capsule itself.
Right.
Um, let's see. Oh, so one thing that I do find interesting is, often House has this very intense need to get an update on his stock and finance portfolio when
Hmm.
he wakes up, because he's under the assumption that in the future money and capitalism are still thriving, and that even 370 years into the future, the firm that is managing his accounts is still operational. I think it says something very interesting about, what the show's trying to say with this character and his interactions with Picard in 1988, because we know, this is the midst of Ronald Reagan, and greed is good, and Wall Street is running very high now.
Gordon Gecko. Right.
Gordon Gecko, exactly. Um, I find it interesting that they have a character that's kind of so on the nose in the times, but at the same time, I think it's interesting that if you woke up 370 years in the future, do you really have the expectation that your financial means have been preserved all this time? Like, for a guy who's supposedly so smart, it makes no sense that he would wake up and actually the first thing that he would do would just go, "Where's my money?" It just seems a little, I don't know. I think it's so stereotypical of him to be this, kind of greedy New York
Yeah.
businessman.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do think it says something interesting about, like, maybe how the writers of the show view the times that they're in 1988 versus what they're
Right.
trying to say with Picard's character later on with his exchanges with Offenhouse.
Well, that was I think they needed to set Offenhouse up as the very aggressive businessman in the late 1980s, because the conversation Picard has with him, Picard describes very well, very succinctly, what you have called the post-scarcity society and what one's goals are when, you're not, the goal isn't to make money and so on. It's really to contribute to society and advance yourself.
Well, I have a quote right here from Picard to Ralph Offenhouse. "A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've
Exactly.
eliminated hunger, want, and the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy." And Offenhouse even kind of admits later on that, it wasn't about the accumulation of things.
It was power.
It was power. And I
Right.
think that is an interesting outlook into the 80s itself, and maybe kind of American materialism at the time. Because, I think you and Mom raised me, but I also think just growing up, I've been exposed to enough to know spiritually that, I think what they've realized in the future, if you're a member of the Federation or a citizen of the Federation, is that you really do have only a finite amount of time in this form, whatever it is, and that you're not going to be able to take these physical things with you. I think that everyone's finally dawned on, like, okay, losing my mind over these things that are completely imperfect and impermanent is not worth stressing for the rest of my life, when I could be doing other things to enrich myself.
Right.
I think that is what. Well, I'm only 2 when 1988 is rolling around. What is the culture like materialistically, and what is this? What is the Offenhouse character speaking to? You think?
No, I think that we've kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of just business, the growth of business. It was the 1988 was the end of Reagan's second term, so it was very much into something we talked a little bit before we started the podcast this evening, that people should get rich because it'll just trickle down to those lower down on the socioeconomic scale.
Was there a real belief that was going to happen?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was a lot of, I mean, from Reagan. I mean, that was one of the bases of Reaganomics, and people, the Democrats or whoever disagreed with that, they referred that to Reaganomics as voodoo economics. Even that was a term that was used.
It's built on this implicit idea of trust, that somehow someone with a lot is going to be mindful of everyone else with a little.
Right. I think the idea was that the people that would become wealthy would have sort of a social conscious, the term I've used for scientists, that these wealthy individuals would have social responsibility. So they would make sure that they would use their wealth so that the people that were, buying goods and doing the base work in society, that some of that wealth would get down to them. But if our boats rise, everybody boats rise, and it doesn't work that way.
Well,
And we're seeing that right now because of the well-defined, well-documented economic disparity that exists in this country now and around the world even.
I don't want to bash your generation because your generation voted in Reagan, but and I'm not bashing you when I say this, but I find it interesting that trickle down economics or voodoo economics was so widely accepted when presented by someone like Ronald Reagan, despite like Iran Contra, despite his teaming with the Teamsters Union and organized religion to go against Jimmy Carter. It just seems odd to me that like the party that had no moral standing to make these arguments made these arguments and were able to sell them. Was there just a general belief that people were better than they actually were? Or was there a belief at the time that maybe the millionaire and the billionaire class were far more altruistic than they actually are?
I don't know if it was that at all. I think that what really brought Reagan in his his economic policy, you have to go back to Nixon and Watergate. That was very traumatic. Ford came in, was the only, one of the, I guess the only non-elected president. He completed, the second term.
Yes.
Then, there was a lot of, angst about the Republicans and so forth. And because they've been in there for 8 years following Johnson, and people wanted to change. So Carter came in, and the economy was tough. I don't remember all the dynamics of it, to describe it, but inflation was very high. I remember in the late 70s, inflation was like 13% a year.
Wow.
For this country, very high. And Carter, because of the Iran hostage situation, and Carter gave his speech about there being a malaise in America, and people have interviewed Jimmy Carter and said, what I was trying to get across is we need to address this. He wasn't trying to have it be a downer, but it was taken that way. And with everything that had gone on, then somebody people wanted somebody fresh and optimistic and, would put a positive spin on things. And Reagan, with his acting background and so forth, and good communication skills, he was able to provide that. One of his, campaign slogans was sort of like, it'll be a new day in America, once I'm president and so forth. So he presented a positive approach to America in the future.
Can I ask a kind of an offshoot question of this, what we're
Sure.
talking about? Because it seems like, we've talked about figures in history coming to power. We recently had a discussion about Hitler as it relates to evil and how Hitler came to power out of Germany's trauma. It seems to me that the reason why Reagan was able to ascend is because he provided a message and a vision that was so different from the trauma that America was experiencing. And this is the question I want to get to. So, there's the Korean War, and then there's Vietnam, and then there's the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, and then there's the Vietnam War, and then there's the assassination of Robert Kennedy, his brother.
I don't think it has to do with that at all. I think it has to do.
Let me finish my question. And then there's Watergate. Why was Watergate and Nixon so traumatic for the country when so much had already happened previously, and even in the scope of 20 years? The assassination of MLK, assassination of Malcolm X.
Nixon's second election in 72, it was a landslide. So I think that there was a lot of, trust in Nixon and so forth. And then people realized that the president really was a crook. But I think more importantly was, if you look at the larger swings between conservatism and liberalism, you know, um, Johnson made a lot of changes with Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and everything.
Right.
So there wasn't, and Nixon was conservative, but he didn't really push it that far because he had to deal with Vietnam, and he did things like he created the Environmental Protection Agency and so forth, and he really concentrated on foreign relations because that was his strength.
Mm-hmm.
Nixon was a good geopolitician. So I think that then Carter was a liberal Democrat. So it was basically time to have, a conservative come back in. And there was a lot of conservative strategizing going back into the late 60s as to, well, how are we really going to put, a conservative in power? And I think that's what happened with Reagan, because I can remember I did not vote for Reagan in 1980, but Mom and I lived in California in 84. And I was positive enough about Ronald Reagan. I think he was running against Mondale that year. But I voted for Ronald Reagan then because there was this positive energy in the country at that time.
Did you ever regret that vote?
Not until recently, because I think, where we've talked about history doesn't become history till it becomes history. I think Ronald Reagan, the other thing I've, recently read some articles is that, talking about this movement, the conservative movement gaining steam, I think the Reagan years put conservatism on a really solid basis that led to, not so much Bush, but, George W. Bush and the neocons following Clinton. But it actually helped set up the environment for what happened the last 4 years.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're dovetailing greatly from the subject of the neutral zone. But, I think the thing that Reagan encapsulates is kind of this foundational aspect of America's renewal. And I think Trump was able to play on that. I think the question I was trying to get to you was like, what caused America's downfall that Reagan had to come along and renew it in the first place?
A whole bunch of things.
So it wasn't just Watergate. It was just a whole bunch of things.
It was a whole bunch of things, right.
Okay. Because in some ways, I think there was this comparison to Trump that people made between Trump and Reagan when Trump came to power. But the difference that I see is that Reagan had like an actual solid economic argument at one point to make in terms of things getting better. He had a foreign policy argument to make that things were getting better, even though the Soviet Union was falling down on its own power. He could look at that and say, look at how well capitalism's doing.
I think Ronald Reagan was basically a decent person. And as he promoted the trickle down theory, he thought that would work. And, to a small degree, perhaps it does. Donald Trump doesn't believe in trickle down at all.
No.
He had no concern.
Well, he doesn't believe in anything.
No, right.
I think that's
except himself.
Well, I think it says something fascinating about our culture as it is, that you can have these kind of charismatic figures come along every so often, especially on the conservative side, and they really kind of run on this character of renewal.
Right.
But the problem is now, like, you would hope that whatever character, good or bad, that ran on this theme of renewal, they would at least run on substance.
Right.
I think the scary thing that we have to realize now, and I know there's probably conservatives listening to this, please understand, I'm not bashing you, but this is a serious problem, and I think it's a problem that we have on the left too. And I would point to, Hillary. I could go on, but I think what Trump proved is that you don't actually have to have substance. At least Reagan, you could say, had substance to his message of renewal.
Mm-hmm.
Trump was able to get that message over of renewal without having any substance behind it. And I think that's a scary thing. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
not actually what's behind the message. You just have to shout the slogan loud enough
Mm-hmm.
to make it
Mm-hmm.
work. Sorry, go on. You were about to say
Well, there was
something?
one of the things I made a note that I think it was Picard says, or some of the, I think it was Picard is looking at the behavior of the three people from the 20th century
Right.
is how did our species survive? And I turn that around is that if you put it today, if the problems we're facing, it's like, how will our species survive the 21st century?
I think that, well, I think there's some things that we need to cover in the Star Trek universe to just so it's made clear. In the 90s, they will go through a nuclear war that we don't experience. That's part of the eugenics war. That's including Noonien Singh. That's when Noonien Singh rises and takes over large swaths of Europe and Africa in terms of a eugenics empire, quote unquote.
Mhm.
They also, they've also had warp capabilities for at least a couple hundred years now. So I think the answer to how we will get past this, and looking at these characters, they're very reminiscent of things that we're dealing with now.
Mhm.
Ralph Oppenhaus could have been Bernie Madoff or Martin Shkreli.
Mhm.
Um, I keep forgetting her name. Claire could be any woman in this country who's facing a real medical emergency,
Mhm.
who has no way out of it. Um, how many people like Sonny are dying from their addictions?
Mhm.
We're looking at this from the lens of 1988, but if you look at it from the lens of 2021, this story is still very vibrant and fresh in terms of the people that are peopling this episode could people this world today and still fit
Sure.
in.
Sure. Absolutely.
Um, I think how we get there, honestly, is just, these people are willing to freeze themselves and be hurtled into space. I think the ultimate thing about humans that helps us win out in the universe is that we somehow figured out a way to endure this tiny pale blue dot. We're probably going to figure out a way to endure the universe in its immensity. I
Mhm.
think that's really the only way I can say it. How we do that, Star Trek posits on this idea that like we're going to do it on this, this miraculous technology of warp drive and um, having Congress both economically and socially with other species.
Mhm.
I think that's a very viable option. Most likely, I think that we are in the immediate heading towards a post scarcity environment. And I've mentioned another show I've been watching a lot of called The Expanse.
Mhm.
The problem with The Expanse is that it posits this future where the human capacity to breed and expand through the galaxy far outstrips our material resources.
Mhm.
And like it, even if we were able to start mining the asteroid belt past Mars like next year, it would take us hundreds, if not 1,000 years, to mine the entire asteroid belt for all the material resources. And there's things on there that like I think people would be shocked. Like there's air, there's water, there's metals, there's precious minerals, jewels.
Mhm.
These asteroids really do contain everything that we would find on Earth,
Mhm.
just in much greater abundance.
Mhm.
You could find an asteroid possibly in the asteroid belt that's made entirely of like iron, and you could just mine that and supply Earth with its iron for the next 200 years.
Mhm.
You know, I think the answer that I think what I'm trying to say to answer your question is I think the way we're going to survive this is by progressing society to where we use our resources in a way to where no one's suffering, but we're also at the same time progressing and getting things done. Um, one interesting thing though that I find fascinating about this episode with these three characters is there's a real worry that they all have about being able to assimilate to the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's fascinating because it's often brought up in science fiction as a convention for storytelling, but it assumes that humans in the future are so different from humans now that they're just somehow, I know that there is this joke about the TV, how
Mm.
everyone, Sonny wants to watch TV so he can watch the Braves, and everyone talks about how TV kind of, I think, died out in the mid 20th. I think he says the 2040s.
Yeah, something like that. It was in the 21st century that TV died out, right?
But I think it assumes that humans don't have an analogous technology for entertainment or consuming their time. While they don't have TVs in the future, they have holodecks.
Well, and I can say, I made the comment that I think that, if you look at how television was in the 1950s and 60s, when everybody had antennas on their roofs and it was through, you know, radio waves to your house from a big tower somewhere, we've advanced to the point where, entertainment is much more diverse because of streaming. I mean, the amount of
Mhm.
content, I mean, when I was growing up, we had three channels. You had CBS, NBC, and ABC, and that was it. And then you started to have these UHF channels.
Mhm.
And now there's so much content, but it's like this is not television. This is streaming. This is internet streaming. And as you say, all right, so we've gone from the simplicity, so to speak, of television to internet streaming. What's going to be next? Some kind of hologram. We've talked about the 3D goggles and so forth.
Augmented reality.
Yeah, augmented reality.
You
Yeah.
know, I, I think that as humans progress, there are some essential things that we keep doing that will remain timeless no matter how much progress we make or wherever we end up as a people or as a species. I think there is a aspect of sport that we're always going to keep going into the future, and we see in previous episodes, a lot of them are taking part in sports and competing. Picard was fencing in the last episode.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there's always going to be an aspect of like storytelling
Mm-hmm.
that humans are going to want to take part in the storytelling. It doesn't matter if they're playing instruments or reciting plays or reading or Data recites poetry. There's I think there's just common human things that maybe that's what Picard's talking about. Like, you finally have time to enrich yourself by doing these common human things that are normal to all of us. We just finally figured out a way for you to go and explore that to its fullest. Um, I think there is. I think the transition between the past and the future is probably, I think, the most startling thing that these people are fearing is not only, the sense of loneliness, especially if you have characters um,
Claire.
like Claire, who, thinks that she's the last person in her family to be alive, and she later finds out she has one descendant outside of Indianapolis, where her family's from.
Mm-hmm.
But I think part of it too is it seems like in the future you have no excuse not to do well. And it seems like one of these things that these people were running from was their past and their inability to get over certain
Mm-hmm.
things. And now that
Mm-hmm.
they're in the future and they have gotten over them, they have no excuse
No.
not to go out and flourish fully as humans. And I think that might be scary for a lot of people because we live in a society that kind of inhibits that.
Yes, and plus they just have the educational gap, that there's things they don't understand in terms of how the culture shifted, how technology has shifted. They just have to catch up with that from a knowledge standpoint, even from a psychological standpoint.
Well, speaking about the design of the future, it doesn't seem like, you know, it's it's the future seen from the viewpoint of designers in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back at it now, like there's certain things that we're using as we speak that makes the technology on the Enterprise D outdated.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't seem like in the future the technology itself has changed that much from, we're still using keyboards to input data. We're still using receivers and transceivers to get data in terms of audio and visual media. I don't think that the transition is actually going to be that hard for these characters. I mean, especially Sonny. Like, Sonny just wants to continue his music career.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that's a very viable thing for him to do in the
Sure.
future.
Yeah, exactly.
Where
Yeah.
in the, maybe his drug abuse was from all the pressures of the music industry that he was in. And now in the future, like, he's not going to have all of those pressures because he doesn't need to make the money, but he can afford to go and tour the galaxy singing old Earth hymns.
Right.
So the one thing that we still have to kind of discuss here are the Romulans themselves when they show up at the neutral zone. The story doesn't reveal who destroyed the Romulan Federation outposts along the neutral zone, even though it's heavily hinted that it's the Borg.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that, we really don't have any hints that the Borg are coming until next season.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels kind of like a lackluster delivery to find out that no one was responsible for these attacks. What do you think about Picard's interaction with the Romulans themselves?
One of the things, I mentioned I watched one of the, original series the other day, and it was an episode with Kirk, and it was Omega Glory, and he got into a fight with another starship captain, and Kirk is very physical in dealing with problems, more spontaneous even, as where Picard is a thinker. He has strong diplomatic skills, and when they realize that the Romulan ship is that they're going to, the Romulan ship is in the area, Riker and Worf want to go to red alert, and Picard takes a careful measured approach and says, okay, we'll go to yellow alert, but I'm not going to go to red alert, and I'm not going to activate the weapon systems because the Romulans won't be able to sense that. And he has previously in the episode, he has a very good conversation where he's listening to Troy. He's really paying attention to her, trying to understand what the basic Romulan behavior is. And the way she describes them, he says, aha, they're counter punchers. So they're not going to punch first. So that's important to his diplomatic stance that, I'm going to go into this, very slowly and not try to avoid escalating it into some sort of, exchange of hostilities and so on, and really understand what is going on. He doesn't want to make a decision without clear evidence as to who the actual aggressor is. And that's sort of a pattern you see during the first season, that Picard wants to make decisions about things based on firm evidence and not just guesswork. And I think, just kind of, one of my other comments and so forth is that what you said about it's finally revealed through the conversation with the Romulans that they're having the same problem the Federation has, is that their outposts are being obliterated. I mean, they're just being scraped off the surfaces of the planets, and they realize that they don't have the capability, the technology to do that. They assume pretty much that the Federation doesn't have the capability to do that. So they don't know who it is. And as you said, the episode ends where, there's not a real firm hint as to who it might be. But we know, looking back, since we know what happens in future seasons, that there's one point where they say that the inhabitants of some of these outposts have been carried off, which says to me that, well, if they've been carried off and there's no bodies there, then they've been simulated.
Right.
And we know who does that.
Right.
So this is a kind of very weak setup for the Borg in the future. As you said, the Borg don't show up. What you told me is that the Borg don't show up early in season 2. They don't show up to near the end. So that's an awful long setup time.
Yeah, they right, they don't. They show up. They're introduced. I think they're introduced within the first 10 episodes of season 2, but we don't really see them again until the end of season 2.
Okay, right.
I think the interesting thing about Picard is, like you said, he does take a really measured approach where he doesn't make any decisions without any clear evidence. I think the fascinating thing that he has to balance is, on one hand, you have this very xenophobic and isolated society that's suddenly coming back out. So there's this clear innate risk of war. But on the other hand, I think that there's always this assumption that if the Romulans were really going to go to war, they wouldn't just attack outposts, they'd be going into an all-out conflict. So I think Picard kind of knows from the get-go, just from the nature of what they're dealing with, that it's probably not the Romulans who are responsible from this. I do find his point about, the Romulans posturing about how they've been away for too long and the Federation has expanded and there's all these people walking in on their territory and crossing the neutral zone, and the Romulans are quote unquote back. I do find that interesting in terms of, our current geopolitical situation here in 2021, where, for the longest time, and it's felt very different over the last 10 years. Well, especially after 2008 when the financial crisis happened. But there has been this sense of the rest of the world has kind of opened up and is kind of creeping in on us, especially when it comes to like China and their technology and the widespread availability of their products. I think you can somewhat say that in terms of Russia's influence in terms of our technospace or our cyberspace. I think it's very interesting that the Federation is seen from the outside, from the outside by the Romulans as this kind of, clear colonizing aggressor. We've spoken a lot about colonization in this series, but I think the Romulans here kind of confirm that. But at the same time, it's also a acknowledgement from them that they've been very lackadaisical in terms of keeping their own hold on power in the system.
Well, it sounds like what happened since, we're whatever's happening to these Federation and Romulan outposts, that both the Romulan Empire and Federation, they are expanding their number of outposts so that you're getting closer to each other.
Yes.
I think I just thought parallels. Look what happened in North America in the late 1600s into the mid 1700s in regard to Britain and France in North America. That was a big, slowly growing conflict of who is going to really be in control of the continent. And of course, that was basically determined by the 7 Years' War, which went on in Europe. But the side of that war was called the French and Indian War here.
Yeah.
And, the French basically lost their grip on uh, North America. They culturally remained in what is Quebec now. And the other thing that you mentioned, the presence that, one of the mistakes that geopolitical stakes that the West may have made after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which, provides some, rationale for the Russians, particularly Vladimir Putin, particularly if you look at Russian history and the Russian psyche of fear of being invaded, particularly
Absolutely.
from Europe, that maybe we shouldn't have expanded NATO, so rapidly. Maybe we should have kept some sort of buffer states like the Russians had after the Cold War, with the Comintern, Warsaw Pact, and so on. I mean, one of the things that happened when the Russians pushed back in Georgia, because there was discussion that, well, we're going to have Georgia in the Caucasus join NATO. Russians, I think, really kind of put their foot down and said, no, that's not going to happen. And so, and I think, the NATO expansion is one of the things that, is catalyzed the whole Ukraine situation, along with
Right.
the Baltic states joining NATO also.
And the uncertainty of the Baltic states in terms of their future as members of the EU in general.
That's true too. That's right.
I think you brought up a lot of really interesting things because on one hand, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's this kind of assumption that capitalism won. And in some ways, Russian history after that, especially during the reign of Boris Yeltsin as president, really does take on this kind of westernized viewpoint that Vladimir Putin kind of, when he comes in the power, almost completely reverses. A lot of people probably don't know who I'm talking about when I mention Boris Yeltsin, but Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia from, I guess, right after Gorbachev. Not after Gorbachev. Did he come after? I feel like there was someone between him and Gorbachev.
No, I think we'd have to look that up, but I think after the Soviet Union fell, there was a couple of years where Russia was like, they were a little in a transition period. Then Yeltsin kind of became the first president. And then afterwards, then Putin, that group came into power.
Yeltsin did a lot of liberalizing with like Western culture and, the Western marketplace. He and Bill Clinton were famously got along in public.
Right.
I think there is this worry that if no one's claiming something, someone's going to come and claim it. So you might as well just go ahead and claim it. I think your observations about NATO speak to kind of that sense of scarcity that still kind of exists in our society where, maybe we don't have material scarcity, but maybe there's now this idea of territorial scarcity where, well, okay, we don't have to fight over material resources anymore. What do we fight over? Well, I guess we fight over, who controls what sector of space versus who doesn't. I think getting into the weeds about the NATO conversation, I don't think it's a mistake from the West that we expanded. I think there was no one that, from my reading of history, it seems like there was no one there, including Russia, to provide the support that a lot of these countries were looking for at the time. And it seems like we were the only one that had any sort of infrastructure to provide in the immediate that probably countries like Russia and China can provide now, especially with China, who's done a tremendous amount of work in places like Africa, providing them infrastructure, even though it's caused their own economic problems. I really do think that the question of whether it's a mistake gets down to that kind of scarcity thinking. I think everyone at the table is probably making the mistake that there is something to fight over. Like, for example, um, the North Sea oil. I'm sorry, the Arctic Ocean, the oil in the Arctic Ocean, not the
Mm-hmm.
North Sea, because there's no
Mm-hmm.
territorial dispute over the North Sea oil.
Mm-hmm.
Scotland owns that. Um,
Norway and Scotland.
yeah, I would say Scotland, but let's give the Norwegians something. Um, the oil around the Arctic Circle, there is going to be this conflict over who owns pieces of that territory, whether it's the US, whether it's Russia. A lot of it's going to come down to like who can fly over what, who can direct their boats through what. But at the end of the day, we're fighting over a resource that we know we kind of can't use going into the future as it relates to climate change and,
Mm-hmm.
really kind of controlling our environment, not only to enable a greater impact for human good, but for environmental good as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're fighting over things that ultimately are, the things that Picard says we've evolved past. We're still fighting over this kind of sense of territory, and in many ways, like, the Romulans haven't evolved past this state, because you made the comment earlier that people are starting to rub up on each other because their borders are expanding.
Mm-hmm.
Why do borders expand? Well, I think for the Federation, the reason their borders expanding is because, well, we went and explored this place and we don't think there's anyone on this planet. Why don't we just put a colony here and expand our territory that way? In many ways, it doesn't seem like that's harmful, and it doesn't seem like a harmful version of colonization, even though we've had previous episodes where what's the one where they were terraforming and there was that organization and there was that organism in the salt layer. But
Right.
for the most part, it seems like the Federation isn't invading populated planets.
No, but again, it's like
But the
getting
Romulans
into
might. The
but
Romulans
getting into
might.
but getting into the Star Trek and Romulans even. What's the need to form these colonies? I mean,
I
if you've got a viable, ecologically balanced, planet or
right.
multiple planets that are part of the Federation, why do you need to go and put a colony on a planet? Now, if there's a materials mining issue,
Yeah.
that, then it makes then there's some sense to it. But are you just going to set up a colony on a planet that is class M or can be terraformed just for the sake of it? That doesn't make a lot of sense
I think
to
from
me.
the to us, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I can see from the Federation perspective in terms of exploration, like if you had a bare planet and you had a team of people that were willing to try to terraform it, yeah, I could see you giving those people that planet. I think from like a Romulan perspective, there's a couple things going on here. It's not only the Federation expanding their territory. We also have to remember that the Romulans have a key enemy in the Klingons, and the Klingons and the Federation are key allies now. So when the Federation expands their territory, in some ways they're expanding Klingon reach as well.
Mm-hmm. That's
So
true.
I think there's multiple facets here. Sorry, go on. You were about to say something.
No, somebody needs to write sort of a little white paper on galactic geopolitics.
I I actually think that someone in the Star Wars fandom did that.
I'm
I'll look.
sure. I'm sure.
So I think that we've kind of reached the end of this episode and just
Yeah.
kind of covering everything.
Right.
Before we go, this is the end of us reviewing season 1 of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Do you have a favorite episode, and do you have an episode that you like the least?
Look real quick at something here.
I think it's very obvious that Code of Honor is just awful.
Go to my list of titles here. Let's see. Why not have a look at this? Let's see.
I actually like the battle. I think the battle's a really good episode where they deal with the Stargazer.
So first, no.
I think my least like episode probably has to be We'll Always Have Paris. Even the Neutral Zone has a little bit more excitement to me than at least We'll Always Have
I
Paris.
just went to my Word files because I have all of my notes, looking at the titles. And I would say I would have to say, my favorite ones were The Battle and Skin of Evil.
Yeah, Skin of Evil's really good.
Yeah, I think Skin of Evil was really good because just the discussion we had about evil, that it can take on almost a physical form and so on. I think what was Lonely Among Us about?
Oh, Lonely Among Us was oh gosh. Where No One's Gone Before, Lonely Among Us. Let me.
Oh yeah, that was the one.
Oh,
the Antigons and the Salayans. Yeah.
Right.
No, that wasn't that. That was okay. Now I would have to say The Battle. I'd agree with The Battle and Skin of Evil. Really.
Yeah. Besides Code of Honor, actually, do you know what? The Lonely Among Us is not bad at all. That's a really interesting one conceptually. Another one that I actually like, Where No One Has Gone Before. I actually appreciate that one a little bit more, especially since they go to the edge of the universe where there's that kind of question of have they reached the end of the spiritual realm? That's a good one.
Yes, that is good. Yes, that's right.
Do you know what's a fun one? 11001001.
Oh yes, that was a good
with the binars. That's actually a fun episode.
Yeah, that was fun one. Yeah.
But I think there's been a lot of really good episodes this season. I also think there's been some real stinkers.
Right.
I'm just not a fan of Symbiosis. Symbiosis and let's see, not I you know what? I appreciate Angel 1 less and less. The more we get away from it. I think Haven and Angel 1 are very similar to each other. And I think Haven's a better episode than Angel 1 is. But other than that, do you have any comments before we go about season 1 and anything you'd like to say?
Well, no, I just think it's an adventure, and we'll I guess we'll talk about how you can clean up all the audio, the soundtracks, and put it up on YouTube, and see what kind of reaction we get, and then we'll talk about how we want to do season 2.
Well, we're definitely doing season 2.
Oh yeah, we are, sure.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the first season of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. Ben, if you're listening to this, thank you for taking the time to listen to your Pop and me. We both love you very much, and we hope that you enjoy this whenever you listen to it down the road. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jay. Good night.
Thanks, Dad.